At the very heart of this unfolding legal drama lies a fierce and deeply consequential dispute, one that goes far beyond the walls of any single courtroom or government office. It is a conflict that touches the lives of millions of Americans, and it all centers on a critical question: who has the power to ensure that the nation's most vulnerable citizens do not go hungry during a time of political gridlock? The battle is over funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which provides essential food assistance to families in need. During a government shutdown, the future of this program, and the well-being of those who depend on it, was suddenly thrown into uncertainty. As a funding gap loomed, threatening to disrupt food security for millions, a federal court took the extraordinary step of ordering the Trump administration to allocate $4 billion to keep SNAP operational for the month of November. This emergency intervention was seen by many as a lifeline for families facing empty cupboards and mounting anxiety. But this judicial action set the stage for a direct and dramatic clash between two branches of government, the judiciary and the executive. The question was no longer just about food aid, it was about the very structure of American democracy. The administration pushed back forcefully, arguing that only Congress—
Okay, so this is absolutely huge. And I mean, this is legitimately one of the biggest constitutional power plays we've ever seen in modern American history. The Supreme Court just had oral arguments on December 5th, 2025, in a case called Trump v. Slaughter. And this case is about something absolutely massive. This case is about whether the president can fire independent agency heads without any cause whatsoever. This case is about whether the president has unlimited power over executive agencies. This case is about the fundamental structure of American government and how power is distributed among the three branches. This is not a small thing. This is not some technical legal dispute that only lawyers care about. This is massive. This is constitutional crisis territory. This is the kind of case that shapes the entire future of the country. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
The legislative branch had the constitutional authority to approve such spending. In their view, the courts had overstepped, venturing into territory reserved for lawmakers. Yet with Congress paralyzed by partisan deadlock and unable to act, the courts felt compelled to intervene, stepping in to prevent a devastating lapse in benefits that would have left countless families without support. The administration's refusal to comply with the court order transformed what began as a funding issue into a high-stakes constitutional showdown, raising urgent questions about the limits of executive power and the role of the judiciary in times of crisis. At stake was not just the immediate future of food assistance, but the fundamental boundaries of power between the branches of government. A debate that would shape the nation's response to emergencies for years to come. Ultimately, the case was destined for the highest courts in the land, igniting a national conversation about who truly holds authority in a crisis, and how far each branch can go to protect the people they serve. In the wake of the district court's order mandating the release of $4 billion in SNAP payments, the Trump administration wasted no time in responding. They immediately filed an appeal.
Here's what's going on. Trump's administration is trying to overturn a 90-year-old Supreme Court precedent called Humphrey's Executor. Humphrey's Executor has been the law of the land since 1935. That's 90 years. That's nearly a century of legal precedent that has been settled law, that has been the foundation of how government works. And Trump's lawyers are saying that this precedent is egregiously wrong and needs to be completely overturned. They're saying that the president should have the power to fire independent agency heads like FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter without needing any cause whatsoever. They're saying that the president should have absolute power over all executive agencies without any limits or restrictions. They're pushing what's called the unitary executive theory. That's the idea that all executive power flows through the president, and the president is the supreme commander of everything in the entire executive branch, with no exceptions. And here's the thing that's wild and frankly terrifying to people who understand constitutional law. The conservative justices on the Supreme Court seem to be listening. They seem to be genuinely open to this argument. During oral arguments, conservative justices asked questions that suggested they might be willing to expand presidential power significantly. They seemed interested in the idea that the president should have more authority over agencies. They seem to be leaning toward Trump's position, and that's absolutely terrifying to people who believe in the independence of regulatory agencies and the separation of powers that the Constitution is supposed to guarantee, because here's what's at stake. If Trump wins this case, he can fire the FTC Commissioner, Rebecca Slaughter, tomorrow. He can fire the head of the National Labor Relations Board. He can fire people at the Office of Personnel Management. He can fire anyone running any independent agency. He can essentially purge any independent agency that's not doing what he wants. He can replace them with people who will do whatever he says without question. He can turn independent regulatory agencies into tools of his personal power and political agenda. That's what's at stake here. That's the real consequence. That's why this matters so much. That's why people are paying attention. And the implications are absolutely massive for the American system of government, because regulatory agencies exist to protect consumers, to protect workers, to protect the environment, to enforce the law fairly and impartially without political interference or pressure. But if the president can just fire the heads of those agencies for any reason or no reason at all, then those agencies become just tools of presidential power. Then they're not independent anymore. Then they're just doing whatever the president wants them to do. Then the rule of law means nothing. Then expertise means nothing. Then impartiality means nothing. Then every decision becomes about politics and loyalty instead of law and justice and what's right. During the oral arguments, Trump's lawyer argued that Humphrey's executor is egregiously wrong and should be completely overturned. He said agencies are wielding executive power now, and the president should control that power completely and absolutely. He said the president needs total authority over the executive branch with no limitations whatsoever. He said there should be no limits on the president's firing power. That's the argument. That's what Trump is pushing. That's the position the administration is taking before the nation's highest court. And the liberal justices on the court were visibly concerned. They asked serious questions about what happens if every decision becomes politically motivated. They asked about what happens if independent agencies lose their independence and become partisan tools. They asked about what happens when politics overrides expertise and professional judgment. They talked about how this could undermine the entire regulatory system and make agencies into tools of political preference rather than tools of law and impartiality and fairness. But the conservative justices seemed interested in Trump's argument. They asked questions that suggested they were seriously considering it. They seemed open to the idea that the president needs more power and more control, and that's the problem. That's the crisis. That's what should concern every American who cares about the Constitution and the rule of law, because the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is now Trump appointed. Trump appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court. Trump's judges are on the court deciding Trump's cases, and they seem willing to give Trump what he wants. And here's something else that's absolutely crazy and frankly alarming. While this case is being litigated at the Supreme Court, Trump is also filling federal judgeships at a massive and unprecedented rate. There are 43 judicial vacancies right now on federal courts across the country. 43 empty seats on federal courts. That's a lot of empty seats. That's a massive number of judicial positions that need to be filled. And Trump has nominated 10 judges to fill those vacancies. By December 2025, the Senate had confirmed 257 Trump Article 3 judges. 257 judges appointed by Trump. That's a massive number. That's basically a takeover of the federal judiciary. That's reshaping the entire court system from top to bottom. So you've got this situation where Trump is pushing for a massive expansion of presidential power at the Supreme Court. At the same time, he's filling the federal judiciary with judges who are likely to support him in his power grabs. He's stacking the court. He's building a judiciary that will back his expansion of executive authority. He's creating a legal system where the president has maximum power and the courts will support that power no matter what. And the ruling in this case is expected in spring 2026. That's right after the midterms. That's right before the next presidential election cycle really gets going. So the timing is political. The timing is strategic. The timing is designed to give Trump maximum power right before the 2026 midterms. And if he wins, he gets to purge agencies. He gets to consolidate power. He gets to punish his enemies through regulatory action. He gets to do whatever he wants without limit or constraint. This is a power grab. This is an attack on the independence of agencies. This is an attack on the separation of powers. This is an attack on the rule of law and constitutional limits on power. This is Trump trying to become a strongman president with absolute power over the entire executive branch. And the Supreme Court might let him do it. The conservative majority might give him exactly what he wants. And that would fundamentally change American government forever. Okay, so let's actually understand what this case is about and what it means. Because this is constitutional law at its most important and consequential. This is about the fundamental structure of American government. This is about separation of powers. This is about checks and balances. This is about whether the president is a king with unlimited power or whether there are actual limits on presidential authority that the Constitution provides. Let's start with Humphrey's executor. This is a Supreme Court case from 1935. It's almost 90 years old. It's been settled law for almost a century. And what it says is that the president cannot fire the heads of independent regulatory agencies without cause. The president has to have a good reason to fire them. The president can't just fire them on a whim or because he doesn't like them. The president can't just fire them because they disagree with him or because they're not loyal enough or because they're enforcing regulations that the president doesn't like or doesn't agree with. The logic behind Humphrey's executor is that independent agencies need to be independent. They need to be insulated from political pressure and political interference. They need to be able to enforce the law fairly and impartially without worrying that the president will fire them if they make a decision the president doesn't like. They need to be able to do their jobs based on expertise and law, not on political pressure and loyalty to the president. That's the whole point of independent agencies. They're supposed to be independent from politics. They're supposed to be based on expertise and law, not on political loyalty and presidential whim. But Trump is challenging this. Trump is saying that Humphrey's executor is wrong. Trump is saying that the president should have the power to fire anyone in the executive branch for any reason or no reason at all. Trump is saying that all executive power flows through the president and the president should control everything. Trump is saying that there should be no limits on presidential authority. Now, there's an argument for this. There's a legal theory called the unitary executive theory. This theory says that the Constitution gives all executive power to the president. This theory says that the president is the supreme commander of the executive branch. This theory says that the president shouldn't have to share power with independent agencies. This theory says that the president should have maximum power and authority. And there's an intellectual argument for this position if you believe in strong executive power. And there are conservative legal scholars who believe in this theory strongly. There are conservative judges who believe in this theory. And the Trump administration is pushing this theory hard at the Supreme Court. Trump's lawyers are arguing that Humphrey's executor is egregiously wrong and needs to be completely overturned. They're arguing that it's an unconstitutional limitation on presidential power. They're arguing that the president needs to have total control over the executive branch. They're arguing that the president should be able to fire anyone he wants for any reason. And during oral arguments, conservative justices seemed interested in this argument. Conservative justices asked questions that suggested they might be willing to overturn Humphrey's executor and expand presidential power significantly. Conservative justices asked questions about what powers agencies actually have and whether the president should control those powers. Conservative justices seemed to be leaning in the direction Trump wanted them to lean, but liberal justices were deeply concerned. They asked about what happens when politics overrides expertise. They asked about what happens when agencies lose their independence. They asked about what happens when every decision becomes politically motivated. They talked about how regulatory agencies need independence to do their jobs fairly and impartially. They talked about how this could undermine the entire system of regulatory protection that Americans depend on. And that's the real issue here. That's what this case is really about. Because if the president can fire agency heads without cause, then agencies become tools of presidential power. Then agencies stop being independent. Then they become politically motivated. Then expertise doesn't matter anymore. Then fairness doesn't matter. Then the rule of law becomes whatever the president wants it to be. And Trump has a specific reason for wanting this power. Trump wants to purge independent agencies. Trump wants to fire agency heads who are enforcing regulations he doesn't like. Trump wants to replace them with people who will do whatever he says. Trump wants to consolidate power in his hands. Trump wants to be able to control every aspect of the executive branch without any limits or checks. Look at what he's already tried to do. He's tried to cut agency budgets dramatically. He's tried to kill environmental regulations. He's tried to weaken labor protections. He's tried to do all these things, but courts have blocked him. Courts have said, no, you can't do that. Courts have blocked his executive orders on multiple occasions. Courts have stopped him from overturning regulations without following proper procedures. Courts have limited his power, and Trump is frustrated by that. Trump is frustrated that courts are limiting his power. Trump is frustrated that judges are saying no to him. Trump is frustrated that he can't just do whatever he wants. So Trump is going to the Supreme Court and saying, I should have the power to fire anyone who stands in my way. I should have the power to replace them with people who will do what I want. I should have unlimited power over the executive branch. And the Supreme Court might give it to him. The conservative majority might say, okay, you have the power to fire agency heads without cause. And then Trump can purge independent agencies. Trump can replace regulatory officials with loyalists. Trump can turn agencies into tools of his personal power. And the timing is interesting and concerning. The ruling is expected in spring 2026. That's right after the midterms. That's right as the next election cycle is heating up. And if Trump gets what he wants, he gets maximum power right before the midterms. He gets to consolidate authority. He gets to punish enemies through regulatory action. He gets to do whatever he wants without limit. And at the same time, Trump is filling the federal judiciary with judges who are likely to support him. There are 43 judicial vacancies right now. Trump has 10 nominees pending confirmation, and Trump has already appointed 257 Article 3 judges. That's a massive number. That's basically a takeover of the federal judiciary. And those judges are going to back Trump's power grabs. Those judges are going to support Trump's executive authority. Those judges are going to rubber stamp whatever Trump wants to do. So you've got this picture where Trump is pushing for massive expansion of presidential power at the Supreme Court. You've got Trump filling the federal judiciary with judges who will support his power grabs. You've got Trump consolidating authority in his hands. You've got Trump building a legal system that backs presidential power over everything else. And the really concerning part is the implications for the entire system. Because if the president has unlimited power to fire agency heads, then agencies stop being independent. Then the president can purge anyone who disagrees with him. Then the president can replace them with loyalists. Then every agency becomes a tool of presidential power. And that undermines the entire regulatory system. That undermines consumer protection. That undermines worker protections. That undermines environmental protection. That undermines impartial enforcement of law. Because now everything is driven by political loyalty, not by expertise or fairness or the rule of law. Alright, so let's break down what this Supreme Court case actually means and what the consequences are going to be, because the implications are absolutely massive and far-reaching for the entire country. First point, if Trump wins this case, he can consolidate unprecedented power in his hands. He can fire anyone in the executive branch who disagrees with him. He can replace them with loyalists. He can turn every agency into a tool of his personal authority. He can essentially become a strongman president with absolute control over the executive branch. He can remove any obstacle to his power. That's what's at stake here. That's the constitutional crisis. That's why this matters so much. That's why people are paying attention to this case. And that's a fundamental threat to the separation of powers that the Constitution is designed to protect. Because the whole idea of American government is that power is divided. Power is supposed to be spread out among different branches. Congress has power. The courts have power. The president has power, but not unlimited power. The president has constrained power. The president has to follow the law. The president has to respect the Constitution. The president has limits. But if the president can fire anyone in the executive branch without cause, then the president has absolute power. Then there's no separation of powers anymore. Then the president controls everything. Then we're not a country with checks and balances. Then we're a country with one person in charge. Second point, this will undermine the independence of regulatory agencies and turn them into political tools. Because agencies like the FTC and NLRB and EPA exist to enforce law fairly and impartially. They exist to protect consumers and workers and the environment. But if the president can just fire the heads of those agencies without cause, then they're not independent anymore. Then they're just tools of presidential politics. And that means regulatory decisions become politically motivated. That means fair enforcement of law doesn't happen. That means expertise gets overridden by politics. That means the rule of law becomes whatever the president wants it to be. That means corporations can do whatever they want because they know the agencies won't enforce the law against them. Third point, this would devastate worker protections, consumer protections, and environmental protections, because those protections depend on independent agencies enforcing the law fairly and impartially. But if agencies become tools of presidential politics, then those protections disappear. Then the president can just refuse to enforce laws he doesn't like. Then the president can replace regulators with people who don't believe in regulation. And that means workers have fewer protections. That means consumers have fewer protections. That means the environment has fewer protections. That means corporations can do whatever they want without worrying about government enforcement. And that means ordinary people lose. Fourth point, this will be a massive power grab that fundamentally changes the structure of American government. Because Humphrey's executor has been the law for 90 years, that's nearly a century of legal precedent. And overturning it would be a dramatic shift in presidential power. It would be one of the biggest expansions of executive authority in American history. And it's concerning that the conservative majority seems open to this. It's concerning that Trump-appointed justices seem willing to give Trump what he wants. It's concerning that the court is becoming a tool of presidential power instead of an independent check on presidential power. It's concerning that the Supreme Court is not protecting the Constitution anymore. Fifth point, this will undermine the rule of law and turn America into an authoritarian system where the president has unlimited power, because the rule of law depends on laws being enforced fairly and impartially by independent institutions. But if the president has unlimited power over agencies, then the rule of law is gone. Then it's just whatever the president wants. Then justice depends on the president's mood, and that's the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. That's the difference between a country governed by law and a country governed by one person who has unlimited power. in this case, is going to decide which one America becomes. 6 point. This is a fundamental test of whether courts are willing to check presidential power or whether they're just going to rubber stamp whatever the president wants. Because the Supreme Court is supposed to be an independent check on presidential power, the Supreme Court is supposed to enforce constitutional limits on the president. The Supreme Court is supposed to say, no, the president cannot have unlimited power. The Supreme Court is supposed to uphold the Constitution. But if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Trump, then the court becomes just another tool of presidential power. Then the court is not checking the president anymore. Then the court is backing the president. Then there are no limits on presidential power anymore. Then the Constitution becomes meaningless. So that's what this case is really about. It's about whether America is still a country governed by law and constitutional limits on power, or whether America is becoming a country where the president has unlimited power and the courts just rubber stamp whatever the president wants. And the ruling is expected in spring 2026. That's right after the midterms. That's right when the next election cycle is heating up. And if Trump wins, he wins big. He consolidates power. He purges agencies. He replaces regulators with loyalists. He becomes a strongman president with absolute power, and the checks on his power disappear. And if the Supreme Court gives Trump this power, it's not just about this one case. It's about the precedent. It's about establishing that the president has unlimited power. It's about establishing that there are no limits on the president. It's about establishing that the president can do whatever he wants. It's about establishing that the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. That's why this case matters. That's why it's a constitutional crisis. That's why people need to be paying attention. Because this case is going to define what kind of country America is. This case is going to define whether we're still a country with separation of powers and checks and balances, or whether we're becoming a country with one person who has unlimited power. Stay tuned, because the Supreme Court ruling is coming in spring 2026, and that ruling is going to shake the foundations of American government. That ruling is going to determine whether the rule of law still matters or whether the president is now a dictator with unlimited power. That's the stakes. That's why you need to pay attention to this case, because this is about the future of democracy in America.